Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Shiur is Leiluy Nishmat, Daniella, Shaina, Aleha Hashalom, Bas Yehoshua, Falik, Sheyichye, who Neshama should have an Aliyah, and only brachas and simchas for Yidden. This Mitzvah Shabbos and Sunday is, of course, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, as we get close to the Yom Tov of Pesach. In these Shiurim, we are studying some of the insights into the Haggadah Shel Pesach. In the third paragraph of the Haggadah, we read the following teaching. Omar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, says the Haggadah, there was a teaching, there was a statement made by a sage from the Mishnah, a Tanaic sage, by the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He said, quote, Harei ani keven shivim shana. I'm like a 70-year-old man. He didn't say that he was a 70-year-old man. He said, I'm like a 70-year-old man. And yet, despite my old age, I still did not merit. I still did not merit that the halacha should follow my opinion, which is, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was of the opinion that the obligation to remember, and to mention, and to praise Hashem for the exodus from Mitzrayim applies both during the day and at night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, my opinion is not just an obligation to say during the day, it's an obligation to say at night. He says, I was of this opinion, and yet the halacha was never ruled in according to me. Ad shedrosha ben Zayma, until a different sage by the name of Ben Zayma came and expounded this law that the exodus from Mitzrayim should be mentioned at night from a pasuk. What's the pasuk? The pasuk says, "Laman tizkar es yom tzeicha meret Mitzrayim kol yimei chayecha." The pasuk says, so that you remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life. Says Ben Zayma, the pasuk doesn't just say to remember the exodus from Egypt, the days of your life, not yimei chayecha, but kol yimei chayecha, all the days of your life. If the Torah had just said yimei chayecha, the days of your life, then it would be obligatory to mention the exodus from Mitzrayim every day. Yimei chayecha hayomim. Since the Torah adds the word kol, all the days of your life, kol yimei chayecha, lahavi haleilos, this comes to include nighttime as well. From here we see that a person is obligated to mention specifically Yetzias Mitzrayim at night, during the night, at nighttime as well. This obligation today follows the halacha of the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, as the Haggadah mentions here. And in fact, we fulfill the mitzvah of mentioning the Exodus, the Yetzias Mitzrayim, not just every day, but also every night. And we fulfill this obligation when we say Shema. The third paragraph of Shema that we say is called Vayomer. It begins with the word Vayomer, and it concludes with Ani Hashem Elokeichem. The pasuk says, I am Hashem your God, Asher Tzeizi Eschem Eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of Mitzrayim. So there it is in the Shema, in the third paragraph, right at the end of the Shema, we have specific mention of Yetzias Mitzrayim, following this opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that the obligation to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim applies every single day and every single night. Okay, that's what's written here in the Haggadah. Why is this mentioned here? Because we wish to highlight, before we get into the details of the story, before we talk about the 10 plagues, before we talk about the splitting of the sea, before we talk about any of the specifics of what actually happened, we're still getting warmed up. So we wish to highlight the significance in general of mentioning and of talking about and of telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So we start off by saying that even though, as we learned last week, that even though we're all so wise and we're so learned and we're so experienced and we're such great scholars, nevertheless, there's a mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we go on to say that this mitzvah applies every single day, and it even applies every single night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I was of this opinion that you have to say it every single night. I didn't merit that the halacha should be like me until along came a colleague by the name of Ben Zayma and explained that there's a hint, there's a reference, a remes to this in the pasuk itself. The pasuk doesn't just tell us to remember the day we left Mitzrayim every single day, but it says, Kol yimei chayecha, all the days of your life. All the days of your life tells us you have to remember this at night as well. This is the simple meaning of what's written in the Haggadah, and this is the context. Okay. Of course, the intriguing part here is, what does Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah mean when he says, I'm like a 70-year-old man? What does that mean, I'm like a 70-year-old man? Was he 70 or was he not 70? right? It turns out, as we're going to learn in a minute, actually he was 18 years old. No, so if he was 18 years old, so why is he saying I'm like a 70-year-old man? Which 18-year-old today in the United States of America specifically, right? The culture is to worship youth. Everybody wants to be young and everybody wants to stay young. I mean, young people in general are not particularly experienced and usually not particularly wise and not particularly developed. But we live in a crazy time, in a crazy world. Everybody wants to be young. Young. No, so from Lozer ben Azariah is young. He's 18 years old. So what's he so proud and saying, I'm like a 70-year-old? And in what way is he like a 70-year-old man? So this, and how is that relevant here? All right, again, the simple understanding is, Rabbi Lozer ben Azariah said, I was surprised that my opinion wasn't accepted until Ben Zayma came and explained it from a pasuk. But what does he mean really when he says, I'm like a 70-year-old man? So here, this is very famous. One of the, probably, I think, the most famous or the most famous stories in all of the Gemara, where in very short, the Gemara tells the story that that there was a yeshiva. There was a yeshiva. This is, of course, after the destruction of the Second Temple. So the yeshiva is, one of the centrally located yeshivas, where all the rabbis and all the scholars are studying. And like every good yeshiva, there is a rosh yeshiva, there's a head of the yeshiva, and abyssal politics, right? Abyssal politics. Go figure. There's conflict, a nishtam conflict between two rabbis, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua. The details of which I don't want to get into right now, although the Gemara spares no detail. The Gemara says that Rabbi Gamliel publicly humiliated Rabbi Yehoshua, publicly, in a way that made all of the other members of the yeshiva very uncomfortable. And they fired Rabbi Gamliel. They fired the Rosh Yeshiva. Okay, fired the Rosh Yeshiva. Now we need a new Rosh Yeshiva. So they started to look around who was a good candidate to be hired in place of the old Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel, of course, was a direct descendant of David HaMelech, but he had publicly disgraced Rabbi Yehoshua. The rabbis were done with him. They were finished. They needed to find a replacement. Be it as it may, the Gemara says they went through a couple of options. The candidate they settled on was Rabbi Lozer ben Azariah. Why? They said, number one, he's a chacham. Number one, he's wise. So he can carry his weight. When he gets challenged in the yeshiva, he'll have what to answer. He has the wisdom. Number two, he's oshir, he's wealthy, right? So if it's necessary to send him to the Caesar, to the king, to intercede on behalf of the Jews, he'll be respected in the palace of the king because he's a man of means, he's wealthy. Number three, he had good yichus, he was 10 generations for Ezra. So they approached him. And they literally said, the Gemara says, they literally said to him, Rabbi Lozer ben Azariah, would you like to be the Reish Masifta, what we would call today the next Rosh Yeshiva? No. So he was young, but as the Gemara says, he was wise and wealthy, and he had great yichus. So he said to the people, he said to the delegation who made him this particular offer, he said to him, you know something? I appreciate the offer of being the Rosh Yeshiva, taking the place of the previous Rosh Yeshiva who was just fired. I appreciate that. He says, but before I give you my answer, I have to go talk to the members of my household. And he went, of course, straight to his wife. Okay? And the Gemara tells us exactly how the conversation went between Rabbi Lozer ben Azariah and his wife. And he comes home and he says, honey, right? So maybe they were having dinner together, eating chicken soup or something like that. And between mouthfuls of chicken soup, or the Gemara doesn't say what they were eating, he says, honey, you'll never believe what happened today in the yeshiva. What happened? He says, they fired the old Rosh Yeshiva and they offered me the job. What do you think? Should I accept it? Should I become the Rosh Yeshiva? His wife says to him, they fired the other Rosh Yeshiva. What makes you think they're not going to fire you? This job doesn't come with job security. He He tells her he'd like to consider taking the position, even if it's just temporary, which turned out to be prophetic, by the way, because it wasn't his for very long, at least not in the form it was initially offered to him. He says, I'll take it, even if it's temporary. If you have an opportunity, he gives her an analogy. He says, if you have an opportunity to use an expensive dish, an expensive cup, wouldn't you use it even if the opportunity is not for very long? I'll take it. So his wife says to him, you have no white hairs in your beard. 18 years old. She says to him, you have no white hairs in your beard, which was her way of saying, you're too young. Nobody's going to take you seriously. He didn't respond. But the Gemara says they went to sleep that night, and when he woke up in the morning, there were 18 strands of white hair in his beard, as an indication, so to speak, from the Ribono Shel Olam, from Hashem himself, that he was not to be concerned with his youth. The Ribono Shel Olam made him look old, right? As I'm saying this, I'm looking into the computer screen, curling away my white hairs. As when he wakes up in the morning, he saw this as a sign from Hashem. Hashem put 18 strands of white hairs in his beard. It was his way of understanding that he should go to the yeshiva and accept the position. And he does. At the age of 18 years old. And the Gemara says, this is the reason why Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah would say about himself, even at the age of 18, I'm like a 70-year-old man. Why? Because he actually looked like a man who was far older, far more senior than he himself was, because of the white strands, because of the white hairs that developed in his beard overnight. And he shows up the next day and he takes the position. Okay. And here is the part where everybody stops telling the story. He was like a 70-year-old man because he had white strands in his beard. He was given the position. His wife told him, you're too young. Nobody's going to take you seriously. Hashem made a miracle. His beard went white. And he walked into the yeshiva and he took over. Here's where everybody stops telling the story. But here's where the story gets fascinating. So he shows up the next day and he says, okay, I'm the boss. I'm in charge. I accept. And they make him the Rosh Yeshiva. Day number 1 on the job. First order of business, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah fired somebody. Who'd he fire? He fired the Shomer HaPesach, the Gemara says. He fired the guard at the door. Why'd he fire the guard? Well, it turns out that his predecessor, Rabbi Gamliel, had a very interesting philosophy. Rabbi Gamliel believed that any student, she'ein toichai kabaroi, any student that wasn't sincere, any student who wasn't on the inside as he was on the outside, any student who portrayed himself in a way that was not authentic with who he was really, any student, any individual that put up a show in any form and presented themselves to the world in a way that wasn't really true to who they really were as a human being and as a Jew, anybody who had any element of hypocrisy and bluff in their life was not welcome in the yeshiva under Rabbi Gamliel's reign. And he appointed a shomer at the door to make sure that nobody insincere would ever be welcome into his yeshiva. Now, how did the shomer HaPesach, how did the guard at the door know who was sincere and who wasn't, and who to let in and who not to let in? Different discussion. The Kotzker Rebbe once said, of all the figures in the Talmud, this shomer HaPesach intrigues him like nobody else. Be it as it may, the Shomer HaPesach was fired by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah on his first day in office. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to the guard, do me a favor, go home. And they opened the doors, and anybody who wanted could come in and study Torah, even individuals who were insincere, even individuals who until this point were deemed as hypocrites and bluffers and not allowed in under the reign of Rabbi Gamliel. Under there's a new sheriff in town. Under the watch of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, everybody was welcomed in. The Gemara says there's an argument how many benches they had to add in order to accommodate the influx of students who were waiting to come and study Torah but couldn't because of Rabbi Gamliel's policy and the guard. One opinion says 700 benches were added to the Beis Medrash. Another opinion says 400 benches were added to the base medrash. Either way, there's a tremendous influx of students. Everybody's coming to hear the Torah as it's being taught by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. On that day, says the Talmud, that they fired Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was welcomed in to be the new Rosh Yeshiva. On that day, there wasn't a single debate, there wasn't a single quandary or query in halacha that remained pending in the Beis Medrash. They answered all the questions. This was a huge day in the yeshiva world. An influx of thousands of students. All the questions get answered, and everything is beautiful and fantastic. Rabban Gamliel, the ex-Rosh Yeshiva, realizes the error of his ways. He realizes that he's made a mistake. He realized that as a leader, he had acted in a way that was inappropriate. He realizes he has to do teshuvah. Concludes the Talmud, Rabban Gamliel went to his fellow rabbi, to his colleague that he had publicly humiliated, to Rabbi Yehoshua, and he went and he begged him for forgiveness, and initially Rabbi Yehoshua resisted, but in the end Rabbi Yehoshua forgave him, and the rabbis welcomed him back as the Rosh Yeshiva. All right, the Gemara concludes, the Talmud concludes, they didn't want to demote Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the new guy who had been Rosh Yeshiva, who had literally, that expression, king for a day. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rosh Yeshiva, alone for one day. They didn't want to demote him. They didn't want to be disrespectful to him. But again, he was, for all practical purposes, a child, 18 years old, with a couple of white strands in his beard. Rabban Gamliel was reinstated as the Rosh Yeshiva. And they said to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, no problem, from now on, the conclusion was, once every 4 weeks on Shabbos, du vezogen the drosha. Once every 4 weeks on Shabbos, you'll give the drosha. The other 3 weeks, Rabban Gamliel will give the drosha. And this is the conclusion of the story of the Gemara. This Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who had the white strands of hair in his beard, says, Harei ani keven shivim shana, I'm like a 70-year-old man, and still I had to work and toil, and it took a while until my opinion was accepted, that the concept of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the concept of leaving Egypt, should be mentioned at night as well. And in fact, in the end, it was learned from a verse, like I said, like we quoted before, and here the commentaries give a beautiful insight, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabban Gamliel, these two sages from the story in the Gemara, the fired Rosh Yeshiva and the young Rosh Yeshiva who took his place, at least for a day, until his predecessor was reinstated. These two Rosh Yeshivas, they obviously had two very different philosophies, two very different ideologies in terms of which students should be welcomed into the study halls of Torah. Rabban Gamliel, the senior Rosh Yeshiva, had a very strict policy, and he enforced his strict policy. He says, in my yeshiva, we don't accept fakers. In my yeshiva, we don't accept people who are insincere. If you're coming here and you're putting up a show, if you're not as religious behind closed doors as you are in public, you come to Shul, you come to the yeshiva, you act like a holy roller, but then behind closed doors when nobody's watching, you don't act the same way. If you're two-faced, says Rabban Gamliel, I don't want you in my yeshiva, get out. Don't come here and study Torah. You're not qualified to be my student. But what if the person wants to study Torah? I want to come and study Torah. Rabban Gamliel says, not on my watch, not here. There's another yeshiva down the road. It's called Yeshiva for Fakers. Go there. Of course, I don't mean that literally. There wasn't another yeshiva down the road. There was not another yeshiva in this vicinity at all. There was one yeshiva. Rabban Gamliel said, if you're not the real deal, I don't care. Don't study Torah here. Go work. Go do something with your life. Go, I don't know what. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, no. The first day in office, he fired the guard, he opened the doors, he turned to every Jew who would hear him, he turned to every Jew to whom his message would reach, and he said, everybody is welcome in my yeshiva to come and study Torah. I don't care whether you're sincere. I don't care whether you live that kind of life behind closed doors. I don't care what you do in private. I don't care what your motivation is. I don't care. It's not important to me. This is a place where we teach Torah. Who's welcome to come and study Torah? Whoever wants. So they added 700 benches to accommodate the influx of thousands of students who were waiting to come and study, but weren't allowed in under Rabbi Gamliel's reign. But the commentaries say, at the end of the story, Rabbi Gamliel is reinstated. At the end of the story, Rabbi Gamliel asked for forgiveness. He did teshuvah, as a good leader should. He begged for forgiveness as a good leader should. He was open and transparent about his own shortfalls, and because of that, the community respected him and welcomed him back. But who wasn't welcomed back? The Gemara doesn't say that they ever brought back the guard. The Gemara doesn't say that they ever reinstated Rabbi Gamliel's philosophy of who could and who can't study Torah. In fact, when Rabbi Gamliel, the Gemara describes when Rabbi Gamliel watches the influx of thousands of students coming in to study Torah, he says to himself, oh my God, look what I did. Look how many Jews I held back from studying. He felt terrible. He had a dream, the Gemara says, in which he was reassured that what he did was correct. But the Gemara hastens to add that the dream was only given to him to make him feel better. It wasn't the truth. And the proof is in the pudding. That part of his policy was never reinstated. From then on, any Jew who wanted to study Torah was welcome into this yeshiva, regardless of his spiritual standing. No guard at the door turned him away. Why is this significant to talk about on Pesach night? Why do we care? I mean, well, it's very important, but why is this significant on Pesach night? Well, you see, my friends, it turns out that the Pesach Seder is celebrated by Jews every single year for the past 3,500 years. For the past 3,500 years, Jews, no Yom Tov is celebrated by the Jewish people like Pesach. All right, Yom Kippur, but Yom Kippur you can't eat, so what fun is that? But no Yom Tov is celebrated by Jews across the world, everywhere, like Pesach. Since the year the Jews left Mitzrayim, literally 3,500 years ago, every single year, almost every single Jew commemorates Pesach in some sort of way. If they have any connection to Yiddishkeit, they sit down at the Pesach Seder. And they eat matzah, and they eat moror, and they tell the story of our ancestors' exodus from Mitzrayim. Some of these Jews are religious. Some of them are not. Some of them know what they're talking about. Some of them don't. Some of them know the meaning and the significance of the Yom Tov and its mitzvahs. Some of them don't. Some of them have the right to call themselves authentically knowledgeable Jews because they really do have the knowledge, and some have no idea. But so many of these Jews want to commemorate and celebrate Pesach. Omar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in the third paragraph of the Haggadah, I was like a 70-year-old man at the age of 18. I became the Rosh Yeshiva at the age of 18. My wife told me nobody's going to take me seriously. But at the age of 18, I ascended to the throne. And I told my colleagues, I told my fellow rabbis, I told them, we have to instate the mitzvah of talking about the exodus of Egypt even at night. Of course, he's not just talking about physical night. He's talking about spiritual night. He's not just talking about the hours from the sunset to the sunrise. He's talking about those times in our history that can be compared to night, where Jews were ignorant and where Jews were far from Yiddishkeit. He's talking about those Seder homes in which, Rahman al-Islam, there's barely any recognition at all to what's really supposed to be happening on Pesach night. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it's time to remove the Shomer Pesach. It's time to remove the guard at the door, get rid of him, send him home, put him on a pension plan. Let every Jew out there know that in this yeshiva you're welcome to study Torah. And the mitzvah of Yetzias Mitzrayim should be mentioned and should be studied and should be commemorated at night as well. For even a Jew who finds themselves plunged into spiritual darkness should be able to sit down on the night of Pesach and say, we were slaves to Paro and Mitzrayim, but Hashem took us out. As long as a Jew is prepared to study Torah, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, into my yeshiva he will be welcomed. And here he will be taught the same Torah as everybody else, and we will tell him, yes, you were a slave to Paro and Mitzrayim, and Hashem took you out. As long as you're prepared to show up to the Pesach Seder, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, whether you're a day Jew or whether you're a night Jew, whether the Jewish history is going through a day or a night, whether they can celebrate the Pesach Seder with guests or without guests, whether they can celebrate it in public or whether they're hiding Rahman al-Islam in some dungeon, in some cellar, because they're afraid for their lives if they're caught eating a piece of matzah. In every single generation, in every single circumstance, the Jews will sit around the table and say, Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. We are free. I'm going to see to it, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. It's my life's mission. He began it at the age of 18, when nobody wanted to take him seriously. This is when he started pushing it. I may have mentioned this before, but I once read in a sefer called Shailus Tshuvas Mimamakim. This was halachic questions that came up Rahman al-Islam during the Second World War. They write in one of the ghettos where they were forced into hard labor, into harsh labor every single day. Before the men would go out to work, they would gather in small groups in the morning to daven with the minyan as much as they could. He said this Rav, his name is Rav Oshri. He writes this tshuva. He says, one day they came to me, one of the Jews came to me while they were davening in the morning and saying brachas. And we were making the bracha, Baruch Ato Hashem, blessed are you Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, shelo yasani oved, for not making me a slave. He says, this Rav writes in this book, he says, and a Jew came over to me and says, can we make a bracha and thank Hashem that we're not slaves? We're absolutely slaves. Forced into a ghetto, Rahman al-Islam, forced into hard labor, Rahman al-Islam. We don't know if we'll survive the day. We don't know if our families will survive the day. We don't know if we'll have another morsel of food to put in our mouths to survive. We can stand there and say, Shelo yasani oved, we're not slaves. And this Rav writes, I told the Jew to stand there and to make the bracha and to say it loud and to say it proud. Yes, from the day that Hashem took us out of Egypt, whether we are going through a day or whether we are going through a night, we remember and we mention the exodus from Mitzrayim, and we tell ourselves and our children and anybody who listen that we are invincible and we are eternal and we are free if we choose to embrace our own destiny. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, nobody was listening to me. None of the other rabbis were listening to me. Lo zachisi. I didn't merit that this opinion should be accepted. Not only I didn't merit my opinion should be accepted, they put a guard at the door and they said any Jew that his inside is not like his outside, any Jew who exists in spiritual darkness, go home. They shut the door in their face. The list of requirements to be accepted into the yeshiva was so long and tall. There were thousands of students who wanted to study and couldn't get accepted. Nowadays, by the way, in order to get accepted into a yeshiva in general, the most important requirement is to write a check. Most of the time, yeshivas will accept students, if they can afford to pay, gesundheit. Once upon a time, I mean, 1 or 2 generations ago, in order to get accepted into certain yeshivas, you had to be of a certain scholarly and academic level. And if you weren't on that level, you were not accepted. And the yeshivas didn't mess around. You had to get tested before you were accepted into the yeshiva to come and study. You had to get tested on tens of pages of Gemara, sometimes hundreds of pages of Gemara. You didn't qualify? Sei gesund. Go away. We don't accept you into our yeshiva. This is an elite quality yeshiva. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, was banging my head against the wall. The rabbis were all moving in the opposite direction. They were making Torah learning more and more exclusive. They said, no, only they Jews can talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. Night Jews are not welcome. Ad Shedrosha ben Zayma, until Ben Zayma came and discovered a pasuk. And in this pasuk, the Torah tells us, the Torah commands us and extols us to remember Laman Tizkar es Yom Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim, to remember the day that we left Mitzrayim. Koil Yemei Chayecha, all the days of your life, all the days of your life. Says Ben Zayma, why does the Torah say all the days of your life? You know why? Because no human being doesn't have a difficult day. There isn't a person for whom the sun shines every day of his life. Everybody has cloudy days and stormy days and difficult days and painful days and days of light and days of darkness. And yet the Torah says, you're to remember the day you left Mitzrayim, every single day of your life. And all the rabbis said, he's right. All the rabbis said, we hear. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is correct. It's time to give every single Jew the message that he or she, no matter their spiritual standing, is welcome to come and study Torah. He or she, no matter their spiritual standing, whether it be of a day or of a night, is welcome to come into the yeshiva, is welcome to a Pesach Seder, is welcome to sit there and say, we were slaves to Paro in Mitzrayim and Hashem took us out. And if we have to add 700 benches into the yeshiva, then so be it. We'll add the 700 benches and we'll never remove them. At some point in the Haggadah, we're introduced to something called a Ben Rasha. Ben Rasha, the wicked son. The wicked son also shows up at the Seder, right? Not on Rabban Gamliel's watch, he wouldn't be allowed in. But on Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's watch, he's allowed in. So the Rasha shows up. And the Rasha sits there and he gets antagonistic and he gets confrontational and he says, what do you guys want? What are you guys doing? And we give it to the Rasha, right? We blunt his teeth and we tell him, if you were in Mitzrayim, you would have been dead. Together with the rest of the other 80% of the Jews who never made it out. Excuse me. And the commentaries say, why? Why do we say that to the Rasha? How is that helpful? If you would have been in Mitzrayim, you would have died with the rest of them. You would never have been redeemed. Yasher koyach nu. What's the Rasha supposed to do with that? They say, no, that's not the message. We're telling the Ben Rasha, we're not telling the Ben Rasha, if you would have been in Mitzrayim, you would have been dead. Therefore, you should be dead. No. We're telling him, listen, my dear Ben Rasha. Listen, my dear child. We have 4 sons. We have 4 children. One of our children, one of our own is a Rasha. We look at this Rasha as a parent to a child. We look at him with love and we say to him, listen, Yetzias Mitzrayim was 3,500 years ago. In Mitzrayim? Yeah, in Mitzrayim you would have had a problem. In Mitzrayim you would have stuck there. You would have been stuck there. But you're not in Mitzrayim, you're here. Now you're with us. Now you're sitting around our Pesach table. Now you're here together with the rest of us. You're complaining, you're upset, you're getting confrontational. We pinch his cheeks, we give him a big hug, and we tell him, you're wasting your time and energy. You're not in Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim, there was a way out. You could have exited through the back door and not joined the Jewish nation. Now you can't. Now you're one of us. When Mashiach comes, everybody leaves. The Chacham, the Rosha, the Tam, the Shaina, the Leiluy, everybody's leaving. We tell them, stop kicking, stop complaining, stop protesting. It's not going to help. You're one of us. Yetzias Mitzrayim needs to be mentioned, needs to be taught by Leiluy at night as well. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, I fought with the rest of the rabbis until they accepted my opinion. I need not tell you that this debate between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and the rest of the rabbis raged on for many, many centuries later. And each philosophy had its approach, and each philosophy had its time, and each one had its merits. But I think it's safe to say that now, looking back in Jewish history, we see the wisdom of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's approach and why the Haggadah puts this in right at the beginning of the story. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, remove the guard at the door. Bring 700 benches in. Welcome every Jew. Tell every Ben Rosha, every self-identified Rosha, everyone who is identified by surroundings as a Rosha, every Jew for whom there's 10 guards at the door waiting to send him home. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, tell them that Yetzias Mitzrayim is for you as well. You and I also are not perfect. We also have to remember that Yetzias Mitzrayim is for us as well. Hashem didn't only take out tzaddikim from Mitzrayim. Hashem took out Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Hashem didn't only take out people who were of the highest spiritual caliber. If you read the story, you discover that many of them were far, far from being perfect. And yet Hashem took them out as well. And we read the words of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah because we want to remember and tell ourselves the truth. The truth is, even with our own lives, we have times in our lives where the sun shines and everything is radiant and we feel like it's day. And there are times in our life where it seems incredibly dark. And we look around the world, and we look around ourselves, and we look around perhaps at the things that are closest to us, and we say, Ribono Shel Olam, what is going on? Everything seems to have gone dark. How can I say Shelo Yasani Oved? How can I say, Hashem, I'm not a slave? I feel like a slave to my society, a slave to my own failures, a slave to circumstances, Rahman al-Islam. How many Jews this year will have to celebrate Pesach alone for the second time in a row? Alone. At times it seems the light has gone out and the world is plunged into darkness. Omar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, if you find yourself Leiluy at night, remember to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim. Don't lose hope. Don't give up the faith. Don't say all is over. Don't say it's nighttime, there's nothing we can do. No. Koil Yemei Chayecha, every day of your life. Every day and every night. Every high and every low, every challenge and every overcoming the challenge, every success and every failure. You know, when everything is beautiful, when the sun, when everything works itself out, it's very easy to say, Hashem loves me and Hashem takes care of me. What about in the hour of despair? What about in the heat of the moment? What about in the center, in the middle of the challenge? What about when we look around ourselves and say, the world has gone nuts. We can't recognize anything. Even then, a Jew will still say, thank you, Hashem, for taking me out of Mitzrayim. Thank you, Hashem, for making me free. And no, as a Jew, I'll never bow to anything else. I'll always remember who it is that I truly am. Yes, I have a Yetzer Hara. Yes, I have my own spiritual fallings. And if you were to put me in front of a guard at the door, perhaps the guard at the door would write me off. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it's time to send the guard at the door home. Every Jew is welcome to celebrate Pesach. Every Jew is welcome to commemorate Pesach. And every Jew is welcome to study Torah and remember who it is that we are and celebrate our identity. And of course, I conclude with this, of course, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said so famously, he said, we talk about 4 sons. Chacham, Rasha, Tam, Sheni, Dei, Lishel. Said the Rebbe, I'll tell you the truth. The truth is there's a 5th son. There's a 5th son. Who's the 5th son? What the 5th son? The Haggadah talks about 4. Why the 5th son? He said there's a 5th son, but the 5th son doesn't show up to the Seder because the 5th son doesn't know that it's Pesach. And the 5th son doesn't care. And the 5th son maybe doesn't even know that he's Jewish or doesn't even know what it means to be a Jew. The 5th son doesn't ask any questions. The 5th son doesn't engage in any conversation because the 5th son is lost. But even he is a son. And even he needs to be welcomed to the Pesach Seder. So says the Rebbe, stand up, go into the street, find the 5th son. Not good enough to remove the guard at the door, right? Not good enough to open the doors and welcome 700 benches of students who are going to come. Not good enough. Once you've welcomed all the students who are waiting to come in, now go out there and find the students who are not waiting to come in. Tap them on the shoulder and say, my dear child, my dear fellow Jew, Pesach hayoim, it's Pesach, you are free. Even you have to remember that you left Mitzrayim. Even you have to eat a piece of matzah, eat a piece of maror. Even you have to learn something about Jewish history and Jewish identity. And it'll become meaningful to you too. Because the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim has to penetrate our lives, has to saturate every aspect of our lives, both day and night, both high and low. This was the teaching of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. This was the life struggle of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah until he was able to break through this, even among all the other rabbis. Hashem gave Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah 18 strands of white hair in his 18-year-old beard, so that everybody else in his generation would take him seriously, even at that young age, and would learn to take him and his words and his message and what he taught, would learn to respect it despite how revolutionary it was at that time. All right, his words still speak to us till today, of course. Hashem should bless all of us with a kosher and a freilich and Pesach. Should be gesund and gebenched and be able to bring the message of Yetzias Mitzrayim into every aspect of our lives, both day and night. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful Yom Tov.